Welcome back to One World. Just 4 months after Tanzania made history by swearing in its first female president, ushering in a new era with some promise of change, the country's main opposition leader is now sitting behind bars. Freeman Mbowe and other opposition members were rounded up this week just ahead of a public meeting they were planning to demand constitutional reforms. Police say Mbowe will be charged with plotting terror acts, including to kill government leaders, and faces treason charges as well. Critics say the arrests are evidence that President Samia Suluhu Hassan is continuing the repressive rule of her successor, John Magufuli, who died suddenly in March. She was his vice president, but she did offer some hope for a new path by vowing to defend democracy and basic freedoms in April. Now, one prominent opposition member in exile is calling for nationwide protests, saying all hopes that President Hassan would end the government's, quote, reign of terror and war on democracy have been dashed. Let's bring in Nick Cheeseman, a professor of democracy at the University of Birmingham. He's done fieldwork on democracy and elections in a number of African countries. Nick, really good to see you. Look, the timing of these arrests, is it important to take a look at the timing as well as the charges of terrorism?
Absolutely. I mean, on the one hand, we've got these charges of terrorism, which is, of course, the easy way of trying to discredit any opposition figure now. You label them a terrorist, and then that justifies committing violence against them and locking them up. But if you look at what's happened, it's very clear that that's not the reason why these people have been arrested. They were arrested before a meeting where they were going to push for constitutional reform. That constitutional reform is a basic argument that many people in Tanzania have been making. Actually, this government and President Magufuli and Samia have recognized that constitutional reform might be a good thing, but they've said it's not their priority. So to arrest them for pushing for constitutional reform, which is, of course, the democratic right of an opposition party, and then to label them as terrorists, really suggests that what's happening here is a crackdown on democracy, and they're using terrorism as a way to justify that.
Okay, so we know that Tanzanian politics have been dominated by the ruling party that's been in power since the early 1960s. The reality is here, when Hassan came into power, she also then has this legacy issue of the structures that have been around for decades and decades. She had promised reform, she had made some moves towards reform, but do you think that she doesn't have enough allies and people in her corner to be able to activate the reforms and changes that she was promising?
I think that's a really great point. I think it's hard to know right now whether what we're seeing is a crackdown that she's launched and she's been pretending all along, or whether actually this is her not being able to control her government. We know that Magufuli appointed key allies throughout the state, the bureaucracy, the Tanzanian intelligence service, for example, and the security forces, and the ruling party itself is staffed with people who sort of bought into his approach, and that approach was a much more hardline approach. And it's quite hard right now to work out, is it actually Samia herself who has backtracked, or is it actually that she's been pushed into this by other more hardline figures? I think what we can say for certain is she has not been able yet to build the coalition that she needs to remove the Magufuli forces and to really push a reform agenda.
Under Magufuli, we saw the blocking of using the opposition's name in a text message. We saw banning of journalists and some media houses. And we were hoping that there was going to be a change, right? This is what Tanzania's people were promised. What message is the current government sending by arresting the opposition? Because it seems optically here, silencing dissent, arresting the opposition at a time where constitutional reform was literally on the cusp of happening.
I mean, really, this is the criminalization of the opposition in Tanzania. If you can't hold a meeting to discuss constitutional reform, you're basically not being able to operate as an opposition party. And this is not just happening in Tanzania. This is happening in a number of different countries, both around the world, but in particular in sub-Saharan Africa, where it's almost becoming illegal to actually operate as an opposition party in a democratic state. And I think we need to really put that into context. We're seeing these moves in a number of different places. We're seeing COVID-19, for example, being manipulated to use social distancing requirements to stop opposition parties from organizing. We're seeing censorship legislation to stop people from speaking, and we're seeing people being arrested on trumped-up terrorism charges. If you put all of that together, you're really hollowing out what it is to be a democracy. You're preventing any form of accountability. And of course, in Tanzania, almost all the MPs in the parliament are from the ruling party because of the way in which the party controlled the last election. So I think we need to be really clear here that this isn't just an isolated incident. This is a continuity of what was happening before the current president came to power. And it basically is hollowing out any meaningful democracy in Tanzania.
Is there a hope that the opposition party members that have been arrested will have a fair trial? Is the judiciary independent?
I mean, that's very hard to say. It partly depends, I think, exactly what happens here. I mean, one of the things that we sometimes see is opposition leaders arrested, detained, harassed, and then the charges evaporate. They might be released at some point later because the government knows that actually it will be embarrassing to put them on trial because they don't have evidence, because the charges are trumped up. So it may well be that this isn't a strategy to actually jail them for a long period of time, that it's a strategy to disrupt them, to intimidate them, to make people be quiet. And in that sense, we might see that it doesn't necessarily get to a kind of proper court trial. The thing I think is also important to keep in mind is that this is happening at the same time as the government is getting a lot of pressure and criticism because it introduced new fees and taxes on sending money to people over mobile phones. And that fee has actually led to a big backlash by people who say that the government is out of touch, that the amount of money that they're trying to charge is pushing people into poverty. And so I think the government right now is at a pinch point moment where it feels pressure on the constitution, pressure because of the misstep over that tax, and that's leading to kind of a fierce reaction. It